Hello students, welcome to EPG Patashala. I am K. Muralidhar. I am an honorary professor and JC Bose National Fellow at the South Asian University in New Delhi. Today we are going to discuss about a module named Communications in Living Organisms. The objectives or learning objectives of this module. After studying this module, you will be able to appreciate the fact that in all regulated activities, that is army action or governance or physiological activities, etc., communications among the components is an obligatory requirement. You will also be able to appreciate the nature of such communication depending upon the hierarchy like language among humans and some other higher animals, chemical communication between cells of a multiple cellular organism, and physical signals like light, sound, etc. if environment communicates with organisms. The other objectives that you will be able to learn is to understand that all communications arise at some source. This is called signal generation, is transmitted through some medium, it is called signal transmission, received by a target which is called receptor site, and this is called signal discrimination, translated by the receiver, this is called signal transduction, and in some cases get amplified, which is named as signal amplification, as in the case of loudspeaker and hormone action. Living organisms are self-replicating, self-referring, autopoietic and evolving energy systems. One of the most important observations made on them is that their physiological and behavioral activities are highly regulated. There is an order in all living organisms. Look at any living organism and we notice a degree of order in structure and in function. Symmetry is one aspect of this order. Perfect symmetry is synonymous with beauty. The structure of any living organism exhibits this order in shape and size, and this is reproducible generation after generation. Observe nature and you will observe high degree of order in form. More important than this is the order in living processes. Take any physiological process like movement, digestion, growth, reproduction, development, behavior, etc. and one notices only order in the sense each of them is a perfectly coordinated set of linked cellular and molecular events in space and in time. You will take some more time and deep study of biology to understand this statement made above. Just watch a galloping horse, a frog catching its prey and gulping it, a honeybee visiting flowers and picking them, honey from them, and making honey out of these flower contents, an eagle flying, a bat scooping on its prey, the movements of a great football player or a cricket player or a pitcher plant trapping an insect, etc. And you will notice beauty or symmetry movements are in order. Metabolic reactions which are underlying all these physiological activities are ceaseless and do not stop even a moment. Moreover, they occur in the form of linked reactions looking like metabolic pathways. The metabolite traffic in metabolic pathways is similar to automobile traffic in city roads, but unlike automobile traffic, nobody has heard of accidents. Metabolite traffic in our cells is perfectly controlled in speed and in direction at traffic junctions. A basic statement which has become a paradigm in describing living processes, and that is that a living organism is a complex system like a army marching, and all activities which we call as physiological activities essentially are regulated activities, and therefore when you have an orchestra or an army or a living organism functioning in different parts, the most important thing required for regulated activity is communication among the different components. That means in the case of a human being, the brain should know what the liver is doing, the liver should know what the intestine is doing. This kind of knowledge about other parts of the body can only be coming by talking to each other, and that is what we call as communication within living organisms. Similarly, if you take a population of organisms, they also do communication, they also talk to each other. That this communication that occurs within the parts of a living organism or among the living organisms of a given population, this communication, if translated, simply says that it is a codified message. It takes place among the organisms, and the most important, most evolved of such type of communication is what we call as human language. But we are not going to discuss this today for many reasons. Not the least is the fact that man is clever enough to use language to hide his thoughts and not to convey any message. And possibly 8 essentially says that this communication that we are talking essentially is of 3 types. Type 1 refers to the communication between or among organisms of a group. Technically, a group of similar organisms is called a population. They belong to one species, or between species. It could be either intentional or unintentional and results in influence. We notice this whether you go into a cinema theater, whether you are traveling in a bus, whether you are traveling in a forest. We notice that this kind of communication does exist. The second type is that between the inanimate world and the animate world. This is essentially a communication, but it is not intentional, because environment consists of both the inanimate and the animate. The inanimate, like light and other things, light, pressure, sound, they also influence living organisms, but this kind of communication is not intentional because it is not done with any design. Essentially deals with the third type of communication that we have been talking about, and this is a communication that occurs among the tissues forming a single organism within our body. If you take a human being as an example, how do brain, liver, intestine or gonads, how do they talk to each other, and what is that language? And that is called as the third type of communication, and we will deal with this mostly during this lesson. Uses this term signal for this means of communication, because we have already said communication or signal is essentially a coded message. So if we now ask a question, how many types of signals are there through which communication occurs among living organisms, we notice that they are basically of 2 types. One which we call as physical type, in which the signal is essentially light or pressure, is also called as mechanical, or voltage, that is electrical voltage. We can give examples for each one of them. All of us respond to sunlight. Most of the green plants respond to sunlight through a process called photosynthesis. Similarly, all of us respond to sound, which is essentially pressure changes in the surrounding air. Many organisms respond to electrical voltage. There are in fact electrical fish which generate this voltage and send it across even a medium like water, by which they can kill another organism. And that, therefore, these are all physical type of communication. There is a second big group of communication through chemicals, and therefore it is called chemical type of communication. And there are examples for this, of which more details we will see. One of them is called hormones. Hormones are chemical communications among the tissues called endocrine tissues and non-endocrine tissues. These are essentially secretions from these endocrine tissues. The second type of communication, chemical of course, is what we see in the neural system, where cells among the neural system as well as the neural cells talking to non-neural systems, it happens through another type of chemical technically called as neurotransmitters. They are released at the end of the neural axon through a process or a structure called synapse. And the third type of chemical type of communication is essentially coming from outside in the form of medicines, otherwise called as drugs. Many of these are clubbed together. Intentionally or unintentionally, we do get exposed to these chemicals from outside, and hence all these chemicals which are coming from outside and entering our body, including drugs, are called as xenobiotics, and the branch of biology that deals with this is known as xenobiology. And therefore, and many of these medicines, intentionally or unintentionally, do communicate with our endogenous tissues, and hence we include them as signals. Most of you realize that all living organisms sense the environment, particularly in the case of higher organisms, let's say a human being. What is that we sense from the environment? We notice that we have 5 senses, as most books will tell you. One is sight, which means we are sensing light from the environment. The second is sound, which simply means pressure changes in the surrounding air, which hits our ears. Third, we have what is called a sense of touch, which is also mechanical in nature. Fourth, we have what is called as taste. This is essentially sensing chemicals in either the food that we eat or the chemical that comes from the air and hits our tongue. Whatever it is, we have the sense of taste. And lastly, we have a sense of smell, which is called as olfaction, which is also the olfactory stimulus is chemical in nature. However, most people don't realize that in addition to these basic 5 senses, which all of us have, maybe 1 or 2 exceptions with 1 or 2 senses, we also possess other senses which are normally not recognized in books. These can be mentioned here. One is a sense of direction. Some people are acutely aware of sense of direction. This is known technically as magnetoception. If you have watched migration of marine fish towards freshwater or migration of birds from Siberia to Bharatpur, you notice a sense of heightened sense of direction. There is a sense of pain which is known as nociception. Some people feel pain acutely, some people are not feeling pain. There is a sense of balance. If you are asked to walk on a wall, you will notice that there is something called equilibrioception by which we balance our body. Then there is a sense of acceleration. If you are moving in an automobile or a truck or any aeroplane, any acceleration, which means change in velocity, we sense it. That is called as kinesthesioception. We also have a sense of time. This is known as Zeitception in German, which simply means whether we have clocks or wristwatches or calendars, without that also we have a sense of time pass. That is also another sense. Then we also sense space. These are called GPS systems in our brain, by which if you are sitting in a room, you have an approximate estimate of the size of the room. If somebody is sitting in front of you, you know exactly how far or how back this person is sitting. This is called sensing the spatial dimension. And lastly, we also have a sense of number. Whether we are knowing arithmetic or not, everybody can count and have it understood in some way. That is called quorum sensing, which you observe even in microbial systems. Elaborates on this concept of chemical signals, and if we analyze the literature in biology about all these chemical signals and ask the simple question, is the chemistry different among all these chemicals? We do notice yes, because these chemical signals belong to different types of chemicals listed here. Some of them are called amino acids, that means compounds which have got both an amino group and a carboxyl group. Some of them are called steroids because they represent a class of chemicals which have got a styrene ring as a backbone skeleton on which functional groups are there. Some of them are broadly classified as lipids, including steroids also are lipids, but they are one branch of lipids. These lipids are otherwise known as fats and oils. Some of these chemicals are sugars, technically called as carbohydrates or saccharides, and some of them, very interestingly, some chemical signals are not just soluble chemical, but they are essentially gases in nature. Nitric oxide and hydrogen sulfide are standing examples. In fact, the discovery of nitric oxide as a chemical signal in living systems fetched a Nobel Prize for this work. And in addition to this, in some cases, in some organisms, in some tissues, we notice that some nucleosides like adenosine function as chemical signals or the derivatives from this adenosine. Talks about these events in a picture where we say that this whole signal can be called as an input, and the responding cell or a tissue is the responder to this signal, and in turn, when the cell, particular cell, target cell or tissue responds to this external input, it itself puts out certain things called as output. Therefore, one notices that inputs responded by the cell resulting in output resembles essentially an electronic circuit. We will see more details about it. Here are some inputs which are like extracellular matrix or nutrients which have come from outside and has reached internal tissues, or signals from other cells which are neighboring cells, or even signals from environmental stress like sound, light, or anything. And inside also, internal states of homeostasis also generates many cells. But then when the cells respond to these, you can see the output in the form of chemical output or a physiological event, and some of them are listed here. It includes alterations in gene expression, alterations in morphological features, alterations in terms of secreting something, alterations in terms of cell number or cell volume increase, which we call as growth, or alterations which may lead to degeneration, morbidity, and even death. All these are called as outputs which come from the responding cell to a given input. Summarizes the entire function of these signals in any higher animal or higher organism, and what it says is that signals regulate everything in physiology and behavior. If we observe all living organisms and ask a simple question, what do they do during their life cycle? We do many things, and those that happen within the body is called as physiology, and those that we exhibit outside interacting with others, that is called behavior. Therefore, behavior is nothing but externalized physiology, and what happens inside is called physiology. One can quote examples like digestion, reproduction, memory, or aggressive behavior. All these come under physiological events. Essentially, it tells the pervading influence of the signals in different branches of biology. Here are some examples. The whole branch of biology called endocrinology deals with how hormones are generated in one place, how do they travel to other places within the body, and how they are giving signal to a responding target tissue which is far removed from the site of origin. And that area is called endocrinology, and this is a huge branch of biology. More than a dozen Nobel Prizes have come for understanding some of the endocrine processes through signaling. Another area that is listed is immunology, of which we briefly referred to earlier, that these are the so-called defense mechanisms, and the contacts and the communication between these immune competent cells are again chemical in nature, and therefore understanding signaling process helps in understanding defense mechanism. Perhaps the biggest example is neurobiology, where neuronal signaling through neurotransmitters essentially controls all our rest of the physiology and behavior. Therefore, including in areas like diseases like cancer biology, we notice that the defective signaling leads to such morbid states or what we call as diseases. Hence, Study and understanding cell signaling has become the core part of reductionist biology in the last 2 to 3 decades. Deals in summary, what are these neurotransmitters, one of the chemical signals that we refer to. So if you look at an adult organism, say a higher vertebrate like man, which means human being, we notice that this whole thing is divided into a region called brain and associated nerves which come out of that, which are known as cranial nerves, and therefore this is known as the central nervous system. Then there are nerves and associated nerve signals which come under what we call peripheral nervous system. These central nervous system, through these nerves, control certain body functions and tissues, whereas the peripheral nervous system, which is otherwise called as sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, through their respective nerves and neurotransmitters, control autonomous tissues like smooth muscle contraction. We are not conscious of this. So essentially, therefore, if you look at body functions which we are conscious, they come under central nervous system. Body functions which happen without we noticing it, they come under autonomous nervous system. Indicates picture in a cartoon form of a typical nerve cell technically called as neuron. And how does this neuron, if you look at this picture, it is indicating it is also a cell. It has got this central cell body, including the nucleus. However, you see projections from the cell surface, of which you see two types. One which we call as dendrites, which are short, and the other which is long, which we call as axon. A nerve, typical neuron, transmits its nerve transmission through neurotransmitters which come through the axon, and then it may reach dendrite of another neuron or a non-neuronal tissue or a cell like a skeletal muscle cell. And there is a junction between the ending of the axon and the beginning of the muscle cell, and that we call as synapse. Through this, the neurotransmitters are released and thereby regulate the function of another neuron or a non-neuronal cell. Essentially summarizes that a tiny tissue called pituitary, which is indicated here in yellow color and which is below the brain or hypothalamus, this tiny gland through hormonal signal can control the function of a major part of our body, including the breast, adrenal gland which is above the kidney, thyroid gland which in the neck region you can notice, bones, ovary and testes which otherwise are called gonads, where the process of gametogenesis and secretions are controlled by these hormones, pituitary hormones, kidney, and even uterus, which is important for a woman for holding the baby as well as for inducing labor or parturition. And these functions of all these tissues are controlled by signals which are chemical in nature called hormones coming from this tiny gland which is present in part of our brain, and that is called as pituitary gland. Teaches us a very important concept in this whole field of endocrinology or in the whole field of signaling, and that is that a signal arises in some part of the body, travels a distance and then reaches the target tissue, and the target tissue responds to it in some readout. What is important in learning from this slide is that whatever comes out of the target tissue itself becomes a signal and can have two effects. One is called feedback inhibition, another is called feed forward activation. Here is an example where TRH or thyrotropin releasing hormone arises from hypothalamus, a region of the brain, travels a distance and acts on the anterior part of the another tissue which we just now named called pituitary gland, and which in response to this signal releases its own hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, a glycoprotein, and this glycoprotein thyroid stimulating hormone is released into blood, and that travels to another tissue called thyroid gland which is in the neck region above the trachea, and this thyroid responds to this TSH, and by releasing in its turn hormones called T3 and T4. But what is interesting here is the concentration of this T3 and T4 in the blood essentially influences not only pituitary in the release of TSH, but also hypothalamus in the release of TRH, where you notice here negative feedback. Another aspect of biological function called reproduction, but which is mediated by signals which we call as hormones. As you see from this slide, the pituitary gland is influenced by higher centers in the brain. We call them CNS centers. Signals from the CNS centers, higher CNS centers, influences the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus responds by releasing certain hormones which are both neurotransmitter and a hormone, therefore they are called as neurohormone. One example for reproductive function regulation is here listed as GnRH, which simply means gonadotropin releasing hormone. This travels down like TRH in the previous slide and acts on what we called as pituitary gland, which is technically is called adenohypophysis. In response to this signal, adenohypophysis or pituitary gland releases a number of hormones. 3 of them are important for this reproductive function regulation, and these are listed as FSH, LH and prolactin. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, LH stands for luteinizing hormone, prolactin of course is abbreviation is PRL. These 3 hormones in their turn travel through blood and act upon gonadal tissue, testis in the male and ovary in the female. Each of these gonadal tissues have 2 functions. The main function is gametogenesis. The testis produces sperms, whereas the ovary in the female produces eggs. In addition, they have second function that they also produce some hormones which are secreted outside. This is called secretory function, and both the secretory function and the gametogenic function is regulated or controlled by these 3 hormones coming from pituitary, and that is what is indicated in this slide. Essentially answers a question that arises from our previous slides and information that we have given, that signals arise somewhere, they travel a distance and then act upon responding tissue. So the question arises, how is it that only one responding tissue responds to this signal? What about other tissues to which also the blood carries the same signal? People have, especially from the area of pharmacology, discovered that the responding target tissue as opposed to other non-target tissues possess in them special proteins which we call as receptors. This slide essentially tells you that there is a receptor for follicle stimulating hormone in the case of humans and other vertebrates, and these receptors are present in the gonad. By virtue of this receptor, whose details, chemical structure and functioning have all been delineated in the area of reproductive endocrinology, these receptors recognize these extracellular signals or hormones, or in this case follicle stimulating hormone, and the binding of this, literally physical binding between the 2 proteins, involves and gets translated as signal transduction, and second messengers are generated within the target cell, and that carries out this function of the hidden message in the signal, and the gonad will respond in the form of either gametogenesis or secretion of steroid hormones. And therefore receptor study, receptor structure function is very important in understanding how hormones or how signals recognize and regulate target tissue functions. We have heard the lesson. In summary, all physiological processes are highly regulated and coordinated activities in living organisms. Coordination is achieved through communication among the components of the system. Whether it is digestion, reproduction, development, response to environment, growth or hormone action, etc., regulation is achieved through a system of communications between the cells. The signals are usually chemical in nature, but in some cases are physical, like light, sound, pressure, electricity, voltage. The chemical signals are either hormones or neurotransmitters. Hormonal signals are low in intensity but loud in effect on the distant target tissue, while the neural signals are high in intensity, that is concentration of the signal molecule, but act at short distances. Feedback inhibition and feed-forward activation are characteristic features of all signal-mediated regulation and coordination. In essence, the organism, it could be a or even a single cell, is always in a steady state, a point with regard to features like blood glucose level or any such thing, and any disturbance or insult from the environment, physical or chemical, sets in motion a self-regulating signaling which brings the system back to the set point. In many physiological and behavioral processes, strangely, anticipatory changes occur to take care of a future disturbance. Placebo effects and developmental changes are some examples of such anticipatory metabolic as well as gene expression changes. This puzzle is yet to be solved. It could be semantic, deficient in understanding these phenomena. Thank you for your patience.